All right, so are you ready for a deep dive into a real classic?
Yeah.
You've probably played Donkey Kong, right? But we're not talking about those versions you remember,
Uh-huh.
like the arcade version or the NES version. Yep. Today, we are going even further back in time,
Mm.
all the way back to 1982,
Whoa.
and exploring the Donkey Kong that was released on the Atari 2600.
Interesting.
What's really wild is this version only had two of the original arcade levels,
Huh.
and Donkey Kong himself
Yeah.
looks more like a fuzzy orange blob
Oh.
than a fearsome ape,
Fascinating. What's so interesting about this version of the game
right?
is that it really lets us peek behind the curtain
Yeah.
of early game development.
Absolutely.
Imagine trying to squeeze this massive arcade hit onto the Atari 2600, a console with a fraction of the power.
I know, right? It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
You might be thinking, hold on, wasn't Donkey Kong a Nintendo game?
Yeah, you'd think so.
Well, here's the thing. Coleco,
Oh.
not Atari themselves,
Yeah.
actually published this version. Back in the early 80s, the licensing world for these video games was a bit of a free-for-all.
Oh, I see.
Coleco had snagged the rights to publish Donkey Kong on home consoles,
Okay.
and they jumped at the chance to bring it to the Atari 2600, which was the most popular console at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. This really paints a picture of just how competitive the video game landscape was at the time. Companies were battling
Yeah.
to get these arcade hits into people's homes.
I know, right?
And it led to some, well, let's just say interesting partnerships
Definitely.
and some really creative decisions.
So just picture this. It's 1982. You've spent countless hours and quarters mastering Donkey Kong at the arcade. You finally get your hands on that Atari 2600 cartridge, pop it in, and things aren't quite what you expected.
I see. Well, you have to remember those early arcade machines, they were powerhouses
Yeah,
compared to the humble Atari 2600. Developers had to work some serious magic
I bet.
to get even a simplified version of Donkey Kong running on the hardware.
Yeah.
And all those detailed graphics you might remember.
Yeah.
Well, they had to be drastically scaled back.
I mean, yeah, Donkey Kong is basically this blocky orange rectangle.
It's true.
And forget about those smooth, fluid movements from the arcade version.
Yeah.
Poor Jumpman,
Yeah.
who we know as Mario now,
Right.
is rocking like 2 frames of animation.
Well, the thing is, even with these limitations,
Yeah.
the core gameplay, that thrill of climbing the ladders and dodging those barrels,
Yes.
is still there.
I mean, that's what makes the game fun.
Right. And it's a real testament to the developer's skill. I mean, they managed to capture the essence of Donkey Kong on such limited hardware.
It's incredible. And to make things even more challenging, the developers could only fit 2 of the original arcade levels on the cartridge.
Oh, wow.
The barrel stage and the rivet stage.
Oh.
No elevators and no pie factory.
This really makes you think. Was this just a creative decision?
Right.
Or did those other levels demand too much from the Atari hardware? Imagine trying to recreate all of those unique background
I know.
and mechanics. It would have been incredibly challenging,
Yeah, for sure.
even for the most talented developers.
It kind of makes you appreciate how much they were able to squeeze into the game.
Yes, it does.
And hey, if you're only going to have 2 levels,
yeah,
those are the 2 to pick.
definitely.
I mean, they're the most iconic ones. Still, I can imagine some players back then were a little disappointed
I bet.
to be missing out on the full arcade experience.
Well, it's a classic example of the trade-offs developers had to make. They had to weigh player expectations against the limitations of the console.
Right.
But remember, this was a time when simply having an arcade game at home was a novelty.
Totally.
So the fact that they even got Donkey Kong running at all on the Atari 2600 was an achievement.
Absolutely. Speaking of things they had to work around, what's the deal with that hammer? It's almost like invisible.
Well, again, it's those hardware limitations. Think of it this way. The Atari 2600 had a very limited number of sprites it could display at once.
Okay.
Sprites are basically those little digital building blocks that make up the characters and objects in a game.
Right. Okay.
Adding a separate sprite for the hammer might have been too much for the system to handle.
I see. So they just made Mario kind of like flash when he uses it.
Exactly.
Almost like he's got super speed or something.
It's a very creative workaround, for sure.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the ingenuity of those early game developers. I mean, they had to find really clever ways to convey the actions and all the gameplay elements within the constraints of the hardware.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, now for the elephant in the room, the sound. Or should I say the lack of sound?
Right.
I mean, where's that catchy Donkey Kong theme music?
Well, you have to remember that the Atari 2600's sound chip was, shall we say, basic.
Yeah.
It could only handle beeps and boops.
Right.
But recreating that full arcade soundtrack just wasn't possible. I mean, it's a far cry from what we hear today.
Yeah.
Those rich orchestral scores that we have in games today. But even with the limited sounds, I mean, those sound effects do a decent job
Yeah, I agree.
of adding to the atmosphere and tension of the game.
True. And hey, maybe all those beeps and boops add to that retro charm, right?
They could.
It certainly takes you back to a simpler time in gaming. But you know what's really cool?
Right.
They actually found a way to sneak in some pretty innovative features. Like
Yeah.
you could change the difficulty of the game, and even how Donkey Kong throws those barrels just by flicking those difficulty switches on the Atari itself.
Oh, right. Yeah, now that's a feature you don't see in many games today.
No, you don't.
It was a brilliant way for the developers to add a little bit of customization and challenge,
Yeah.
all within the limitations of the console.
Yeah.
You could just crank up that speed for a real nail biter,
Right.
or you could dial it back for a more relaxed experience.
Oh, totally. And get this. They even added in a progressive difficulty.
Oh, wow.
Every time you completed the game, it would loop back around and get a little bit faster.
Oh, man.
Talk about an old school challenge. I'm sweating just thinking about it.
So imagine you're a gamer in 1982. You finally get to play Donkey Kong at home.
Right.
But it's this simplified version.
Yeah.
Visually, orally. And even in terms of content. How do you think people reacted to it?
Well, remember, this was still a time when home video games were still relatively new.
Yeah.
And the idea of having an arcade hit like Donkey Kong in your living room, even with all those limitations,
Yeah.
it was mind-blowing.
It must have been.
Sure, I'm sure there were some people that were disappointed
Yeah.
that it didn't perfectly match the arcade experience.
Yeah.
But I think for most people, there was just a sense of awe and appreciation for what the developers had accomplished.
Yeah, I bet the reviews at the time were pretty mixed, though. It must have been
Good.
tough for these reviewers.
And to balance the excitement of having Donkey Kong at home
Yeah.
with the reality of the Atari 2600's limitations.
Well, it's important to remember the context. This wasn't just some lazy port, like a cash grab.
Right.
I mean, the developers were working within incredibly tight constraints, pushing the boundaries of what was even possible. And compared to some of the other home console versions of Donkey Kong that came out later, like the one for the ColecoVision, which was much more arcade accurate.
Right.
This version really shows you how much those early consoles struggled
Yeah.
to keep up with the arcade.
So this Atari port became a kind of cautionary tale for game developers, right? Like a reminder that squeezing those arcade experiences onto a home console was no easy feat.
I wouldn't say it was a cautionary tale. I think it was a much more valuable learning experience.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't about failure. It was about the realities of technology at the time.
I see.
It highlighted the challenges that these developers faced in adapting arcade games to a totally different platform.
For sure. And even for gamers today, it's a good reminder that the games we take for granted now, with their stunning graphics and complex gameplay,
Yes.
have roots in these early, more humble attempts.
Back then, just squeezing every last bit of performance out of the hardware was a constant battle.
Absolutely.
And speaking of limitations, let's delve a little bit deeper into how they actually affected gameplay on this Atari version.
Okay. Yeah, it really does make you wonder, how do they create something so iconic,
Yep.
even with all those limitations?
I know, right?
Imagine playing Donkey Kong for the first time
Yeah.
on the Atari.
Yeah.
You got your joystick,
Yeah.
one button, that's it.
It's so simple.
There's no fancy controllers, no extra buttons, just pure, simple gameplay.
And you've really got to be precise with those controls, too, because the game doesn't mess around.
Oh, no.
One wrong move.
Yeah.
Or like a mistimed jump. And you're toast. It's a real test of your skill.
It really is.
And your timing.
All those early games, they demanded a certain finesse, didn't they?
Oh, you really had to learn the game's quirks.
Yeah,
Master those jumps.
Yeah.
And develop this, feel for how everything moved.
absolutely. Speaking of those jumps, the Atari version's jump mechanics could be a little, well, let's just say interesting.
Oh, yeah.
The Atari 2600 wasn't really known for having sophisticated physics.
Right.
You might think that you've, perfectly cleared a barrel,
Yeah.
only to find yourself, mysteriously knocked off a platform.
Oh, man. It adds, like, a certain element of unpredictability to the game, right?
Oh, it definitely keeps you on your toes.
Yeah.
And that's where those difficulty switches really come in handy.
Yeah, right.
If you want a more relaxed experience, just dial it back a notch and take your time. But if you're feeling brave,
Yeah.
crank up that speed and see how long you can survive against Donkey Kong's barrel onslaught.
It was such a clever way to add replay value
Oh, for sure.
and cater to all those different skill levels, all without needing any fancy menus or settings.
I don't know, right? You literally just flicked a switch
Yeah.
on the console.
Ah,
So low tech,
right.
but so effective.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a little pro tip for anyone brave enough to tackle the Atari version of Donkey Kong.
Okay, I'm listening.
Pay close attention to those barrel patterns.
Oh, yes, those barrels. They're not exactly random, are they?
No, not really.
I mean, there's a certain logic to them.
Well-
a pattern you can learn
Yeah.
to anticipate. And once you figure it out,
Uh-huh.
dodging those barrels, it becomes like a rhythmic dance.
You make it sound almost graceful.
Yeah.
Oh, we've talked about the graphics,
Yeah.
the sound,
Yeah.
the gameplay.
Right.
But where does this particular version of Donkey Kong actually fit into, the larger picture of video game history?
Oh, that's a good question.
I mean, it wasn't exactly the most faithful adaptation.
No, it wasn't.
But it was definitely one of the first to bring the arcade experience into people's homes.
It's a fascinating case study, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, on the one hand, it is the simplified port,
Right.
a pale shadow of the arcade masterpiece. Yeah.
But on the other hand, I mean, this represents a pivotal moment in gaming history.
Yeah.
It was one of the first attempts to translate that arcade magic
Yeah.
to a home console.
Absolutely. And it really introduced millions of players to Mario for the very first time.
It's true.
Even if he was just, Jumpman back then,
Yeah.
this version really helped pave the way for the more polished, more faithful ports that came out later.
Right. It's like a stepping stone.
Yeah.
A bridge between the arcade era
Yeah.
and the rise of home consoles. And while it might not be like the definitive way to experience Donkey Kong,
Right.
it's a really valuable piece of gaming history.
It really is. It's a reminder of just how far we've come
Oh, yeah.
and how much we owe to those early pioneers who just dared to dream big,
Absolutely.
even when faced with these seemingly insurmountable challenges.
I mean, just imagine.
And for anyone who wants to see just how quickly gaming technology was evolving back then, I highly recommend checking out that ColecoVision version of Donkey Kong.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, the ColecoVision. Now, that was a much more faithful adaptation of the arcade original.
Oh, totally.
You see, the ColecoVision,
Yeah.
it had more power under the hood, so the developers were able to recreate the visuals and all the gameplay elements
Yeah.
with much more accuracy. I mean, comparing the two versions side by side is like watching a time lapse of progress.
I know, right? It's
Yeah.
amazing. It really makes you appreciate those leaps and bounds that were being made in gaming technology
Yes, it does.
at the time. And it makes you wonder, what will future generations think when they look back at the games we're playing today?
Oh, I know. It's a crazy thought.
Right. Will they marvel at our primitive graphics
Right.
and our limited processing power? Will they, dissect our code,
Yeah.
trying to understand how we were able to squeeze so much
Yeah.
into those tiny little cartridges and discs?
It's a thought-provoking question, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, what seems so cutting edge to us today will inevitably just become, retro and nostalgic tomorrow.
I know. It's weird to think about.
And just like we're so fascinated by the limitations and innovations of the Atari 2600 Donkey Kong, future gamers might look back at our games with that same sense of curiosity and wonder.
Yeah, you're right. So let's savor it all, right?
Yes.
All the blocky pixels, the simple sound effects, the challenging controls, all the innovative workarounds. These elements are all part of what make this era of gaming so unique and memorable. As we wrap up this deep dive into the Atari 2600 version of Donkey Kong,
Yeah.
I can't help but feel a sense of respect for those early game developers.
Oh, absolutely.
They were true pioneers. I mean, pushing the boundaries of what was even possible
Totally.
with, such limited technology.
It's pretty inspiring, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, they weren't just copying the arcade game.
Right.
They were adapting it, reimagining it for a completely different platform.
yeah.
And by doing so, they created something unique, something that really captured the spirit of Donkey Kong.
For sure. It makes you think about the power of constraints. Sometimes having limitations can actually force you to be more creative,
I think so.
to find innovative solutions that you wouldn't have considered otherwise.
Absolutely. It's a lesson that applies to so many different fields, too.
Yeah, I think so.
Not just game development. You know, when you're faced with limitations,
Yeah.
whether they're technological, budgetary, or even just time constraints,
Yeah.
it forces you to think outside the box and
Yeah.
come up with these really clever workarounds.
It really does. So what's the big takeaway for our listeners today?
Mm.
Well, I think it's this. The Atari 2600 version of Donkey Kong is more than just a, flawed port
Hmm.
or a nostalgic curiosity.
Right.
It's a window into the early days of gaming, a testament to the creativity and ingenuity of all those early developers.
And it reminds us that gaming history is full of these fascinating detours
Yeah.
and side paths.
It is.
The games that weren't quite perfect, the ones that, pushed the limits of technology,
Yeah.
the ones that, despite all their flaws, actually helped shape the industry that we know and love today.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even the biggest franchises,
Yeah.
the most iconic games, they had
Yeah.
really humble beginnings.
That's true.
They started as simple ideas
Yeah.
built with limited tools,
Yeah.
driven by the passion and ingenuity of,
Yeah.
a handful of developers.
It's amazing. So the next time that you are playing a modern game, with all its stunning graphics and complex gameplay,
Yeah.
take a moment to appreciate the journey that got us here.
Oh, yeah.
A journey that started with all the blocky pixels, simple beeps, and a whole lot of heart.
And who knows, maybe someday someone will be looking back at the games that we're playing today with that same sense of curiosity and fascination.
I'm sure they will.
Right. Maybe they'll be trying to figure out how we were able to, squeeze so much detail
Right.
into those polygons, or how we created those immersive worlds, or how we pushed the boundaries of storytelling and interactivity.
It's exciting to think about, isn't it?
It is.
The possibilities are endless. And the future of gaming, it's wide open.
Well, to all you deep divers out there, keep exploring, keep
Yeah.
playing, keep asking those questions. Because there's this whole world of gaming history out there just waiting to be discovered.
And who knows what incredible innovations and those creative breakthroughs are just around the corner.
That is a wrap for our deep dive into the Atari 2600 version of Donkey Kong. We hope you've enjoyed this little journey back in time. Until next time, keep diving deep.